Hey, quick favor, we need your input. For a few weeks this August, we are going to be giving ourselves our usual late summer break, and as usual, we'll be running some favorites from the archives. But this year, we are asking for your help in deciding what to run. In our newsletter, we're going to be doing a series of votes on what episode we should feature each day. So it's up to you to chime in, and that will help us decide. All you have to do is subscribe to the This Day newsletter at thisdaypod.com. We'll be sending out our first poll soon, so jump on it. From fitness routines to mental resilience, navigating personal goals to tackling burnout, we could all use a little help being human. And that is what the Life Kit podcast from NPR is here to do. As I'm sure you've noticed, life does not come with a manual, but you still have to make choices every day, some big, some small, and these shape the direction of your life. Well, Life Kit delivers strategies to help you make meaningful, sustainable change. I personally am still in summer mode over here, and lately Life Kit has been really delivering with advice on how to improve your grilling or make a salad for your next picnic, how to beat the heat on a humid day. Ice towels, people, ice towels, they really make a huge difference. But of course, even when you are in summer mode, life still presents much thornier issues, and Life Kit has recently done episodes on preparing your home for possible flooding, staying out of credit card debt, making hard decisions together with your spouse. I promise, if you go to the Life Kit feed and take a scroll through the topics, you will find something that will help with a dilemma in your life. So go ahead and check it out. Listen now to the Life Kit podcast from NPR. Hello and welcome to This Day, a history show from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, August 1945, 80 years ago, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. The United States dropped atomic weapons on those two cities in an effort to bring a quick close to World War II. President Truman, who ultimately made the decision to use the nuclear weapons, wrote that he wanted his generals to, quote, use it so that military objectives and soldiers and sailors are the target and not women and children. This, of course, did not happen. In the initial bombing and then in the aftermath, some 90,000 to 170,000 people in Hiroshima and some 60,000 to 80,000 people in Nagasaki died. 90% of them were civilians. There are, of course, so many ways to mark this 80th anniversary. There's the voices of those people on the ground, the American scientists who developed the bomb, the political leaders in this country who convinced themselves that dropping the weapon would be the only way to end the war, which is something that historians will be debating for eternity. Our guest today is Garrett Graff, historian and author who has written oral histories of D-Day and 9/11 and now has a new oral history out, an attempt to try and capture all those different voices and difficult questions on the ground and in the halls of power. It is called The Devil Reached Toward the Sky. And Garrett, welcome back to the podcast. Nice to see you.
Thanks so much for having me.
And folks might remember that Garrett was on not that long ago to talk about the early internet and Wikipedia, and you switch gears impressively. But as we were wrapping up that episode, you said, I have this book about Hiroshima and Nagasaki coming out. And we said, we'll have you on. And here you are. But here also are Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hey there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So I want to get into all those various strands and kind of what you learned. But I mean, when we say oral history, when people hear oral history, and we're talking 80 years ago, I suppose the window is closing for people who actually have stories, who were part of this story, right?
That was exactly my interest in tackling this project. As you mentioned, I've done two previous book-length oral histories, one about 9/11 that came out in 2019, and then one about D-Day that came out for the 80th anniversary of D-Day last year. That was called When the Sea Came Alive. And all three of these projects sort of have a similar historical moment at different ends of the arc that have got me interested in tackling them. So the 9/11 book came out in 2019, The Only Plane in the Sky, and brought together the voices of about 500 people who experienced that tragic day, morning to night, coast to coast. And 2019, of course, the 18th anniversary of 9/11, and it was a moment where, for sort of our purposes, 9/11 was just beginning to slip from memory into history. You had the first servicemen and women going through basic training and deploying to fight in Iraq and Afghanistan in wars that began before they were born. You had the first firefighter candidates going into FDNY who, were born after that day that killed 343 firefighters. And the story that generation was being told about 9/11 is this like very neat and clean and simple one. And Nicole and Kellie, and your sort of college experiences, you probably see this with your students all the time, which is like the story that they hear is the September 11 attacks begin at 8:46 in the morning. They're over 102 minutes later at 10:28 with the collapse of the second tower. There are 4 planes, 4 attacks, Pennsylvania, the Twin Towers, the Pentagon, and 3,000 people die. And for those of us who remember 9/11, that's not the day that any of us actually lived. We didn't know when the attacks began. We didn't know when the attacks were over. We didn't know how many attacks there had been. And we didn't know what came next. And for me, the power of oral history is putting people back into the shoes of the people who are living these events before they know how the events are actually going to unfold.
But I would imagine, Garrett, that it's much different to try to tell that story when it's like 18 years later and it's still kind of fresh in people's minds. But 80 years later seems like a much bigger lift.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so I've sort of gone back now to World War II with the D-Day book and with this Manhattan Project book for the same but slightly different reason, which is this 80th anniversary of the end of World War II marks really the unofficial final passing of the greatest generation. So we are at a moment where we have today every first-person memory we are going to have of these events. And that sort of at some point in, the next couple of weeks, months, or years, like the last living survivor, participant in these events is going to die. And so trying to, again, take people back to these events that we sort of view entirely through a historical lens now, that have slipped permanently from memory into history, and put people back in the moments of the uncertainty of what it was like to actually live these events. And
most of these people, I'm guessing, are they teenagers at the time? Are they children when this is happening?
So for both D-Day and the Hiroshima book, it was all archival research. It was diving back into, letters, memoirs, oral histories, sort of local institutions have done or the government has done. I had a huge trove for the Manhattan Project book, this new one. The Oak Ridge Public Library in Tennessee, down the road from Nicole, had actually done this amazing oral history project, actually with audio and video of the people who had actually, worked at Oak Ridge. And then, the Japanese government has done some really amazing oral history projects with the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I actually went to Hiroshima and Nagasaki as part of the research and had the opportunity there to speak with a survivor myself. But effectively, the goal with both of these projects, both D-Day and Hiroshima, was to get the memories as close to the original events as possible.
So I was surprised, at least last year, according to the World War II Museum, there were 66,000 U.S. veterans of World War II still alive. I was surprised that was that many. And most of them are in their 90s. But I think the projection is by as you said, Garrett, by about 2040, that generation will have fully passed. And so, yes, the window is there. So,
and by the way, that's a number that in 1944 was about 1.5 million or 2 million. When you hear 66,000 still alive, that counts an enormous number of participants who were not the 168,000 people who actually landed on the beaches those days.
Yes, of course, of course. So I want to get to, what you learned in this book, and I think take your premise, I think, that there is an inherent tension between the story that history, codifies and the lived experience on the day. Was there a particular part of Hiroshima and Nagasaki story that you kind of had an instinct would be more complex when you went to the actual oral histories?
Well, I think there were a couple of things that really stood out for me in looking back on this. One is, I think in our popular historical mythology, we have sort of shrunk the story of the Manhattan Project down to J. Robert Oppenheimer and sort of a bunch of his physicist buddies at Los Alamos. And, Oppenheimer was an awesome movie. I loved it. It's actually, for a movie, stunningly historically accurate.
Yeah.
But the sheer scale of the Manhattan Project is what you really come away from a project like this amazed by. And that, Los Alamos is like 6,000, 8,000 people. Oak Ridge was a town of 100,000 people.
Wow.
At the peak in World War II. Hanford, Washington, where we made plutonium, was also a town of 100,000 people. These are towns that did not exist, were desert and forest land in 1942, and that we built these, massive, 80-mile by 80-mile facilities that employed 100,000 people each to manufacture plutonium, manufacture uranium. On the day that the atomic bombs were dropped and announced to the world, August 6th, 1945, the bus system in Oak Ridge was one of the 10 largest public transit systems in the United States. And it was a city
crazy.
And it was a city that did not exist on a map, that no one knew it had, been started at all outside of sort of some mountain valleys outside of Knoxville.
I'm so curious because you mentioned Oppenheimer, and famously the story around Oppenheimer is how conflicted he was and how he turns on his invention and feels like a deep culpability for what's been unleashed on the world. Is that same sense of inward looking and self-reflection and conflictedness about the project, is that present in these more distant locales as well?
Yes, but in a different and sort of equally fascinating way, which is, as we mark this anniversary, the thing that we associate the atomic bomb with is the war with Japan, the war in the Pacific, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. When you get back, and again, this is to me is, I think, part of the value of oral history and sort of listening to people as they tell their own stories, as they experience these events. The whole point of the Manhattan Project was to stop Adolf Hitler. That it was this, weird ragtag group of mostly Jewish refugee scientists from Europe who had fled the advancing cloak of fascism and authoritarianism in Europe and come to the United States with this knowledge, with the knowledge of nuclear fission. Literally Niels Bohr lands at a dock in New York City as one of the 4 people in the world who knows about nuclear fission. And the US government does not care at all. And they spend 2 years going around and knocking on doors of, one military office or another, up to and including getting Albert Einstein to write Franklin Roosevelt himself to say hey guys, this nuclear fission thing is a big deal and not something we want Hitler to get first. And so they launch this effort and spend, 2.5, 3 years of the war racing Adolf Hitler for the bomb, thinking all this time that Werner Heisenberg is leading an equally talented group in an equally massive effort to develop the atomic bomb. Of course, in a weird way, the anti-Semitism of Germany keeps Hitler from ever drawing on the Jewish scientists in Germany to actually build the bomb. And so they never really get off the drawing board with a nuclear weapon plan. And it's really only in the final months in 1945 where the scientists, Oppenheimer on down, sort of begin to really realize, wait, we're going to beat Hitler before the bomb is ready. And we don't need this weapon to defeat Germany. And should we be using this bomb at all? If Hitler doesn't have it and we're going to win, can we just not use this thing?
Hey, this is David Rind. I'm an audio producer at CNN. And one of my favorite things about working at CNN is that I can call up our super smart correspondents and reporters whenever I want to pick their brains about the news and the stories they're covering. Well, I want to bring you in on those conversations with our podcast, CNN One Thing. Each week, I grab one of those said reporters and we break down one big story that's been making headlines. Again, the podcast is CNN One Thing. Listen on your favorite podcast app.
As summer winds down, I'm all about refreshing my wardrobe with staple pieces for the season ahead. And Quince nails it with luxe essentials that feel effortless and look polished, perfect for layering and mixing. I recently went and picked out a couple pairs of slacks, a light jacket, because that crisp fall air will be here before we know it. And then I was looking around the Quince website and I noticed a section I hadn't seen before: kids. I'm not sure if this applies to you, but oh my gosh, my kid is going back to school soon. And not only that, they grew over the summer. That always kind of sneaks up on me. Well, luckily, Quince has stylish and affordable kids' clothes, so I quickly snagged a linen overshirt, a pair of kids' jeans, and even some new running pants. They also have kids' backpacks, by the way, just a tip. So, whether for you or whoever, elevate your fall wardrobe essentials with Quince. Go to quince.com/thisday for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/thisday to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/thisday.
Can you talk about Truman then and his decision to drop it? Because people were encouraging him, you don't actually have to do this. What brings Truman to the point where he decides, no, we're going to do it anyways?
Yeah, and the amount of sort of historiography around the decision to drop the bomb generation by generation is the subject of many very good and very thorough books on its own. But the decision to drop remains pretty controversial up to now, but I think what we have sort of come to understand in the last couple of years is the bomb, knowing what Truman knew then, it was probably the right decision for him to drop the bomb. And that sort of all of the following are true, which is dropping the bomb sped the Japanese surrender. We've sort of gotten more details in recent years that even the night before the surrender on August 14th, after two bombs had been dropped, there was still a coup inside the Japanese government by hard right military leaders who stormed the imperial emperor's palace and tried to find and destroy the record that had been recorded of the emperor's surrender message to be aired the next day. Japan's government was still relatively far from surrendering in early August 1945. 200,000 Japanese civilians are dying every month in 1945 from starvation.
Wow.
And, in a very cold calculus, the war ending in August saved Japanese lives and American lives. I don't think that necessarily means like it was the best thing that we could have done. I think one of the things that you really see when you get into the witness testimonies and the survivor testimonies is nuclear weapons are not just like any other weapon. That they are community destroying, people destroying, civilization destroying weapons that are fundamentally different than any other category of weapon. But again, had we not dropped the bomb, one of the things that a lot of Americans, I think, today don't understand is we were already destroying almost every single city of any size in Japan. The deadliest day of World War II was not Hiroshima or Nagasaki. It was the Operation Meeting House firebombing of Tokyo in the spring of 1945, where we killed 100,000 Japanese civilians in a single night, the single deadliest night of warfare and conflict in human history. And Curtis LeMay and his bombers went on from there to bomb 66 other Japanese cities by August of 45. And ironically, we had saved Hiroshima and Nagasaki in order to bomb them with an atomic bomb. Had we not had the atomic bomb coming, we would have firebombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki long before August of 1945 and potentially killed, as many, if not more, civilians in that moment. I mean, these firebombs, destroyed 30, 40, 50, 60, 70% of a city in a single night. And, were cities, the American equivalent of New York, Cleveland, Fort Worth, these are, 66 of the biggest cities and towns in Japan.
Wow. And I wonder if, because you were in these archives, that also gave us some perspective on the Japanese side of this equation. I mean, what do you learn from including these civilian voices and the Japanese voices in this story? Yeah.
The book is sort of a weird mix of a story, right? Because it is this incredible advance in science and technology. It is one of the most sort of, it is humans unlocking one of the fundamental powers of the universe. The industrial might that America brings to bear in the Manhattan Project is the story of how we win the war. I have this line in the introduction of the book that, like, we think of World War II as being fought in, Guadalcanal and El Alamein and Bastogne, but it was won in the factories in the United States. It was won in the bomber factories at Willow Run in Michigan. It was won in the landing craft and shipyards of Higgins Industry in New Orleans. And it was won in Bletchley Park in England with the Enigma code breaking, and won in, the uranium work in Oak Ridge and the plutonium work in Hanford, Washington, things that no other country at the time could have mustered the industrial might and will to do. And then you get to the very final chapters of the book, where we see one of the, I think most epic tragedies of modern times. And, I think part of what you see jumping back and forth between the Japanese perspectives and the American perspectives is that push and pull of tragedy and triumph. Because, the crew of Enola Gay, which dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, they have a really awesome day on August 6th, 1945. They land, there's a huge party for them. They all get medals pinned on their chest and go off and drink beer and have a barbecue on, Tinian in 1945. You know, a lot of the Los Alamos scientists, you know, they're celebrating this moment. You know, a lot of the people at Oak Ridge and Hanford, they learned for the first time what they're doing on August 6, 1945. You know, the teams that make the uranium in Oak Ridge, they've never heard the word, most of them have never heard the word uranium before Harry Truman speaks it out loud on August 6, 1945. Wow. And for them, you know, the end of the war outweighs everything. You know, I have these like amazing quotes from scientists and you know, some of the engineers working on the project who are like my brother, you know, was a Marine flamethrower in Okinawa who was due into the second wave of the Japanese invasion. Like, I could name the members of my family who live because we dropped the bomb that day. Like, I was proud of my work because, like, I can name 6 people whose lives I saved that day who were, you know, family members headed into the Japanese invasion.
That's remarkable.
Yeah.
It's also so interesting to me, like the complicated legacy of this that you were talking about. You know, I've spent some of the last few months studying the My Lai massacre and in the archives around that. And people are debating what U.S. war crimes are and what they mean. And the most common example, it's not the fire bombings, even though people at that point know how deadly the fire bombings in Japan and Dresden were. But it is the decision to drop the nuclear bomb. And they're like, if that wasn't a war crime, then going around and killing 500 women and children and old men in My Lai can't possibly be a war crime. And that it's being used that way rhetorically just feels so different from the kinds of conversations that, you know, the people in 1945 are having. Although I think that there is some of that concern, but it's just, it hasn't been metabolized in the same way, and it's still weighted so much more heavily against the end of the war.
Yeah, and I think part of this is we also lose track, I think, of the sheer scale and size and scope of World War II, which is, this is a conflict that killed 60 million people.
That's
you know,
like that. You got to stop right there. I just feel like that is a number people cannot get their heads around. 60 million people.
And I quote Edward Teller, the sort of very famous physicist in the book, who talks about, you know, his reaction of standing at the Trinity explosion, which is the first atomic explosion, and talking about, like, you have to think of the permission structure of 1945, which is, you know, we have already seen the siege of Stalingrad. We have already seen, you know, there are American troops, you know, still working their way through concentration camps in, you know, the spring of 45, you know, learning the scale of the Holocaust. This war kills 15 million combatants, 45 million civilians in sort of the roundest possible numbers. And, you know, when I say it killed 60 million people, if we didn't drop the bomb, do you know the number I would still say that the war killed? 60 million people. Million. Like, this is, you know, like, I think it is too sort of pejorative to say that the atomic bomb is a rounding error on the end of World War II. But at the scale of the loss of life, you know, we still round off the number of Chinese dead in World War II to the closest 5 million. Like, like, this is a scale of conflict and death and atrocity that is just almost impossible for us today to wrap our minds around.
You've done an incredible work here and gathered up all types of different voices, and I think you've advanced the cause of the oral history and the gaps in our knowledge. But I'm sure you feel that there are still some that remain. And so I'm curious, you know, kind of as we started talking about how we see these voices slipping away, is there a particular strain, a particular kind of voice, a particular group of people who you feel like we have to hear what they have to say urgently before it's too late?
I mean, I think the sort of shortest possible answer to your question is it's already too late for, almost anyone who actually worked on the project. I mean, the people who are still alive from this are the, Japanese survivors, who were, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, 11 years old. There's almost no one left from the actual Manhattan Project itself. I think one of the things that does stand out for me that I really did want to do with this project is the voices of the Hibakusa, the bomb-affected people, the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They are the most harrowing reading I have ever done as a historian. And I say that as someone who has previously written oral histories on 9/11 and D-Day, which were not exactly the happiest days for the humans caught up in those experiences. And I worry a lot at this moment that, and I think that this intersects with a lot of Nicole's work, at least, as well. What we are losing as we lose the greatest generation is the voices of the people who understood how hard it was to fight fascism, how hard it was to root out fascism once it takes hold, and how hard it was to build the international order for peace and stability that came after. And I do not think for a second that it is a coincidence that exactly 80 years after the end of World War II, our country is where it is in the arc of democracy backsliding, because the generation who is responsible for that backsliding, the policymakers and the elected officials, grew up under the umbrella of peace, stability, and protection created by the greatest generation and take it for granted. And that sort of think that like America is where it is today because it will always be in the place that it is today. And that we are the, world leading economic superpower because their entire lives, we have been the world-leading economic superpower.
Yeah.
And what they have lost sight of is, like, what happens when NATO doesn't exist? Like, what happens when the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and the dollar is not the reserve currency of the world? And that the generation who fought World War II knows that. They can name the people whose lives that fight took, and then came back and built a better, more just world in order to ensure that that never happens again. And, I can sit around today and, I have my list of complaints about the United Nations and NATO and the IMF and the World Bank, but what they built worked. And what I fear at this moment, sort of voice-wise, and one of the things I wanted to do with the D-Day book and with this Manhattan Project book, is show how hard those fights actually were. And remind this generation of the legacy that greatest generation gave us, and sort of leave people with the challenge of how are we going to carry this forward in our time.
Yeah, I think it's so important to have that example of people doing the hard work, because I think it's going to be up to this next generation to replicate that hard work.
It's kind of an eerie way to end things, but I think you're spot on. Just thinking about how much we have taken for granted the world that we live in and the peace that has been sustained for decades. We think of it as inevitable, and it is not.
Yes. And, this was a generation that had lived through 2 world wars in, a single generation. And they built a system that, again, in round numbers, kept peace on the continent of Europe for 8 decades thereafter. And the sort of Europe that I have known for my entire life is not the Europe that any generation of human history has ever known before.
No. Wow. Well, that is, a sobering and powerful note to end it on, but we really appreciate it. And, we talk about the hard work, and I think the hard work of doing this oral history helps in the overall project you're describing. So thank you, Garrett, so much for doing this. The book is called The Devil Reached Toward the Sky, out now as we mark this 80th anniversary of the atomic weapons being used. But yeah, thanks for doing this.
Thanks so much for having me. It's always so fun to be with you guys.
Nicole Hammer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia. From